some of the common myths that go with ADHD. The first one is that people with ADHD cannot focus. So it gives a bit of understanding to why individuals with ADHD have really poor time management, is because they actually are underestimating the time that's happening, and they're missing tasks, or they're late for things, is because at a biological level they're perceiving time differently to everyone else. If we are more that inattentive type, we have a huge difficulty and a pervasive inability to inhibit all the other sensory information that's coming in. So no wonder you're highly distractible. No wonder it's really hard to use working memory and to hold attention on things. It's because the orchestra is just playing all these different instruments at the same time, and we're not really having off when we need on, right? Why on earth would we give stimulants or amphetamines to young children? But if we understand what amphetamines do to the dopamine systems in the brain, Welcome back to Expressions of Interest. My name is Tom Greer-Smith, and I'm a performance psychologist currently working with Surfing Australia, but I'm also a generally registered psychologist with the Medical Board of Australia. Today is a deep dive from one of our previous episodes with Jason Patchell. Now, we spoke a lot about fear in that episode, but at the start of the episode, we spoke about neurodivergency, and in particular, ADHD. And what I wanted to do is more of a deep dive, a deeper understanding of what actually ADHD is, what it's not, because I had so many conversations with mates recently, and it's just sort of popped up, and that just in normal conversation, they're like, "Oh, I think, I got ADHD." I'm like, "Do you?" Like, what makes you think that? And then I was chatting to my barber, and he's like, "Yeah, no, I think I got ADHD." And what I found was that the common understanding of what ADHD is compared to what I know it is clinically is quite different. So I wanted to go into a bit of depth today. Not too much depth, hopefully keep it, fairly understandable and tangible, but I wanted to give a greater understanding of what ADHD is from a diagnostic point of view. So I wanted to run through kind of the diagnostic criteria, how I go about diagnosing the condition, and then some of the myths that go with it. And then from then, we need to talk about the underlying neurochemistry that goes with the disorder, and then why then that enables some treatments to work. So that's how we're going to frame things up. But to begin with, I think it's important, even though, yes, I'm a board-certified psychologist, I'm not an expert in ADHD. So I preface that with, if you are concerned and you want to know more, absolutely try and find an expert in ADHD. Different psychiatrists or pediatricians are going to be more of an expert in this. But as a psychologist, it is something that I do diagnose and provide provisional diagnoses around. So therefore, I wanted to give my lens on that. So I think what's helpful is to give a broad understanding of the different categorizations, or the way I see it in psychology. So if we look at assessing different orders, I like to think of it as three broad areas to look at. So firstly, you've got your psychotic disorders. So your psychotic disorders are things like bipolar and schizophrenia, and they tend to be more, they have a genetic predisposition to those disorders, and they're characterized by quite severe impairments in functionality and normal ability to move around in the world and understand the world compared to how everyone else does. The next category is we've got neurotic disorders. So we've got psychotic and neurotic. The difference in neurotic is, neurotic disorders such as depression or anxiety is you weren't born that way. You weren't born anxious. You weren't born neurotic. Something happened in your concept of yourself or your concept of the world that then brought about some defense mechanisms that are maladaptive, meaning that they have a negative, although well-intended, they have a negative consequence on your day-to-day living. And differentiating between those two is, I think, really helpful to understand going, is this something that might require some medication, or is this something that might require more psychotherapy? Not to say that you can't do psychotherapy for psychotic disorders. There's just some underlying hardware problems, and that's kind of how I differentiate it with clients, is like psychotic disorders, hardware. Neurotic disorders, software challenges, right? And it's not obviously as black and white as that, but it's a good way for adolescents in particular to understand is like, yeah, we can do some software updates. We can, through psychotherapy and a few different other behavioral avenues, is like, yeah, we can, because the behavioral updates is the way that you got here. So therefore, we can do some different software updates to change that. And yes, obviously there's some genetic influences in there. But then if we look back to the psychotic disorders, it's going, yeah, that's hugely hardware influenced. There's underlying problems with either neurochemistry or brain regions. So it's going to require a little bit heavier treatment with the hardware challenges. And also it's lifetime. Like you can be, we can manage some of these symptoms, but you're going to have bipolar for the rest of your life. We can't cure it. So then we've got this third category called neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is where ADHD falls in as well, like with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and different learning disorders as well. And as the name suggests, it is a neurological condition that happens through development. And so that gives us a bit of understanding of the complexities that go with ADHD, and that it's a broad categorization of groups, because although it's highly comorbid, meaning that there is a high likelihood when someone has ADHD, they have ASD, or if someone has ASD that they have ADHD, doesn't mean that you can't have one without the other. And also, with ASD, the research is pretty clear that that's going to be staying with you for life. But the interesting research around ADHD is that some people can grow out of ADHD, which is really, really interesting. So it's kind of, there is a genetic predisposition to it, and there's some environmental things that change. But fundamentally, there is some challenges in the underlying neurochemistry that we see through development. So now we've got that broad categorization in there. So let's chat about actually what ADHD is, which, if we name it, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So I think the first thing to understand is that, believe it or not, it's not just one, just get diagnosed with ADHD. It's not just one thing. There's different types within it. And because some people might have historically heard of it being attention deficit disorder, ADD. The reason why we put the hyperactivity in there is that we actually have three different presentations of it. It's like, one, you can have the inattentive type, and that's what it's called. And that's characterized by a lack of attention to detail, difficulty sustaining attention, poor organization, poor time management, easily distracted. And the inattentive type is probably less understood, or it's not the common understanding of ADHD. Most people think of ADHD as the hyperactive type, which is, they're always on the go, they're fidgeting, they're moving, they're talking excessively, they have a really hard time waiting their turn, they butt in. That's that more classical view of hyperactivity, because you can see it behaviorally. But it's important, and this is the bit that gets quite commonly underdiagnosed is the inattentive type by itself, because you don't see it behaviorally as much. And what ends up happening is individuals and kids that are more intelligent is they find and develop ways to deal with and overcome their attentional difficulties and their organizational difficulties and their time management difficulties. So it doesn't look as common, but they're really working hard to be able to attend to what they're doing. So if we then understand that at a diagnostic level, the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, is the book that we use to categorize and define disorders in psychology. There's 9 symptoms or 9 criteria in both the inattentive and the hyperactivity realms. The important thing is that let's differentiate between normal difficulties in attending or a bit of excess energy compared to clinical levels of inattention and hyperactivity. So most people are going to probably endorse a couple of these symptoms on a test. But you need to meet at least six or more of the 9 diagnostic criteria, and at a threshold higher than the where the clinical line is at. And I don't want to go into details on that, but some people might have moderate levels of all 9 criteria, but it's got to be at a clinical threshold, right? And some people have a mixture. So that's why there's that third category is a mixed presentation rather than a predominantly inattentive or predominantly hyperactive presentation, right? And then after that, there's also the differentiation of severity, mild, medium, or severe. Makes it easier for clinicians to understand then of possible treatments and what to do. And like all these things, everyone's kind of on a bit of a spectrum of how much it impairs their functioning. And then the other thing we need to understand is, where does this present? And so we use this term triangulation of information, is going, okay, let's say you endorse a bunch of these different symptoms, but in what settings? Because if you just endorse it in the classroom and you got a 12-year-old kid that's experiencing all these difficulties in the classroom, but they're not experiencing it at home or in social settings, then there might be something wrong with the classroom, not a pervasive inability to hold attention. And so that's one of the diagnostic criteria, is going, do we see these in 2 or more settings? And are we seeing 2 or 3 people also seeing these symptoms, right? So it's not just this self-report measure that and going, yeah, this is difficult, but are multiple people seeing these difficulties across multiple settings? That's really, really important. And then the other important thing is going, do we see some of these symptoms and difficulties before the age of 12? And the reason why we want to see that is, as we categorize it at the start, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. So we're going to see through the development of the child some of these difficulties popping up in their life. So if it's not before the age of 12 because of what's happening within their neural architecture, it's going, okay, what's currently happening in their life that's making things difficult to attend, or they're feeling this hyperactivity, experiencing this hyperactivity. And then finally, can we rule out that there's no other medical cause for the lack of attention or the hyperactivity? Because there could be some pharmacological reason, some physiological reason. So really, we're trying to rule out all these different things when we're doing a diagnosis. And there's slightly different ways to do the diagnosis. Some people do behavioral assessments as well. Sometimes there's working memory assessments. There's emotionality, dysfunction assessments. All these things go into it. But I just wanted to paint a very broad picture of what on earth ADHD is from a diagnostic criteria point of view. And this doesn't mean that you go, oh, okay, I said yes or I endorsed those few symptoms that Tom said. Now I think I've got ADHD. It's like, no, again, see a registered health professional. And then if it's a child case, then you would need to see a pediatrician, especially if there's potential medication. And then in adulthood, it's a psychiatrist if there's any medication involved as well. There's a number of layers to this. So if we look at some of the common myths that go with ADHD, the first one is that people with ADHD cannot focus. And what we see is that people with ADHD actually can focus really, really well and quite intensely on things that they really care about. And you go, well, how can that be? How can they care? How can they focus on things that they care a lot about, and then everything else they have a hard time understanding what's going on? And you ask, how can that be? How come they can focus on things that they find really interesting for long periods of time and quite intensely, but things that they're disinterested in and they don't really like, they find, like schoolwork, they find exceptionally hard to focus. And one of the things with that is that there's this curiosity and importance in caring that goes with things that we really like. And what ends up happening is our levels of dopamine, which is a neuromodulator, dopamine, you've probably heard about that, this drive and desire and motivation chemical, that gets modulated or influenced when we like something a lot. We're going to have a bit more tunnel vision of it, and we're going to care about that. And we'll get more on the role that dopamine plays in this, because this is starting to give us a bit of a key to how all this whole ADHD thing works. But I wanted to go into another myth is that only boys have ADHD, or that it's a male trait. It's like, well, males are far more diagnosed with ADHD. That's true, but that's in part because of that men or boys are more likely to demonstrate the hyperactivity side of ADHD. So you can see it commonly in a classroom is the kid can't sit still. The kid's bouncing off the walls and he's fidgeting, and that's a really easy one to see, and maybe we should do something about. With girls and females, it's more common that it's underdiagnosed, and what tends to be a more likely situation is they actually have more of what we would call emotional lability. So they have a harder time regulating emotions, and so their emotions fluctuate a lot, and they have a hard time inhibiting these different emotional states that they have, and that causes them a fair bit of distress. So it definitely affects the both sexes, but in slightly different ways. If we look at what's happening there, is that part of the problem, and this goes with the myth of that they can't focus on things, it's more that they're over-focusing on something, and in the attempt that people with ADHD are over-focusing on something or trying to focus on something, they miss a whole lot of information in the background. And one term for this is attentional blinks. And the analogy for that is if you're doing Where's Wally and you're trying to find Wally, is like your focus is so narrow and tunnel visioned that you're missing all the other information that's on the page to try and find Wally. So there's all this other stuff that you're just not seeing. And we call it attentional blink because you're shutting off or closing off all the other information in there. And sometimes that happens in not when you're hyper-focused on a task, but in general life, is that you're trying to focus on something and then someone's saying something or there's something else going on and you got no idea that all this other information is going on there. That is quite challenging for certain people with ADHD, and because people, especially for kids in classrooms, the teachers go, "You're not paying attention." It's like, well, no, I was just struggling really hard to pay attention to this one thing, and then this other thing distracted me, and now I can't attend to this other thing over here. So it's this ability to inhibit other information from coming in, all this other sensory information. But there's also what happens in there too is the actual physical nature of blinking too, which is really, really interesting, because what research has shown is that the quicker we blink, the higher rates of blinking, our time perception changes. So if you're really awake and caffeinated, you're going to blink a lot more, which means your segments of time that your brain takes in is increased, so your perception of time is increased. But the inverse is also true, is that when you're tired and you haven't had enough sleep, or say with people with ADHD, is that their blinking rate decreases, and their perception of time, they underestimate the time that it takes to do something. And which is really, really interesting, because what also mediates the amount that you're blinking is dopamine. Back to our old friend dopamine. So both the amount that you physically blink changes your perception of time, and the availability of dopamine in the brain also changes your perception of time. So it gives a bit of understanding to why individuals with ADHD have really poor time management, is because they actually are underestimating the time that's happening, and they're missing tasks, or they're late for things, is because at a biological level they're perceiving time differently to everyone else. And it's absolutely fascinating when we sort of understand more of the neurochemistry that underpins what's happening for these individuals. And that leads us to, okay, let's actually define what's happening here with dopamine, because it seems to be playing a major role. And it does. So there is this low dopamine hypothesis that seems to be held up in research with individuals with ADHD. So dopamine, like other neuromodulators, influences a lot of different structures in the brain, and therefore a lot of different behaviors, and they do multiple things. One thing that dopamine does, as we said before, is that increases in dopamine allow certain structures in the brain that that control focus and attention. And we see this with some medication and with drugs, is that there's this tunnel vision of focus, and auditory, there's this cone-like hyper-awareness when we see increases in dopamine. The other thing that dopamine does is it also inhibits neural activity, right? So it's like there's an orchestra, and certain instruments need to be playing at certain times, and we need to inhibit other ones playing at different times so it actually sounds like what it's supposed to do. And what happens with people with ADHD is, because there's a low amount of dopamine, we can't inhibit certain brain regions from firing, and therefore it just kind of comes across as a bit of a mismatch, a bit of the brain, bit of misunderstanding of what I need to do. And if we see that in other disorders, like look at Parkinson's. Parkinson's is also classified by a low amount or a low bioavailability of dopamine. And so we see people like Michael J. Fox, and they can't inhibit motor movements. And so that's why you get the trembling and the motor movements, the invasive and uncontrollable motor movements that go with Parkinson's, is because there's a dopamine problem. And so now we're starting to understand what's actually happening for these individuals with ADHD, is that because there's a low amount of dopamine in the brain, and the availability of dopamine, if we are more that inattentive type, we have a huge difficulty and a pervasive inability to inhibit all the other sensory information that's coming in. So no wonder you're highly distractible. No wonder it's really hard to use working memory and to hold attention on things, it's because the orchestra is just playing all these different instruments at the same time, and we're not really having off when we need on, right? And also, on top of that, even if that wasn't happening, high amounts of dopamine gives you more that drive and that motivation and that desire to do something. And so they're going, well, I don't want to do the homework. I don't care about that. That's really difficult from a chemical point of view. And then if that's hard to do biologically, physically, what's that going to do to your belief and your self-efficacy of doing that? Is you just go, well, this is the hardest thing in the world, and I've got to sit here, be still, listen to the teacher, and try and focus on the stuff. Well, I have a hard time focusing. And so what we see with individuals with ADHD is they get far more negative reinforcement from teachers and other people in their life because they're constantly getting in trouble. So they think they're a bad person or that there's something wrong with them and everything like that. And it's like, no, that would be hugely frustrating. So they're frustrated internally because they have a biological difficulty to inhibit or to stop all this sensory information coming in. They have a very hard time biologically to actually concentrate, use working memory on that. And on top of that, they also have a hard time, some individuals had a hard time regulating emotions because that's also firing. So they're frustrated on so many levels, and that's why we see this sort of heightened emotionality that goes with individuals with ADHD. Not all the time, but quite commonly, because that whole setup sounds pretty frustrating, right? And it's a very interesting setup. Then if we've got on top of that with, now we're in the classroom, and just in general, 8-9-year-old kids have a hard time sitting down for a couple of hours, and we don't need to go into the difficulties of the common schooling system. But you ask this 10-year-old boy to sit down when he's got an inability to inhibit unwanted motor movements. It's like, yeah, that kid's going to be moving, jittering, talking to someone says something. Yeah, that's a very tricky situation for that kid to move through. No wonder they're going to get in trouble and they get told they're a bad kid. It's like that's a tricky setup. But if we take a step back and understand around this low dopamine hypothesis, it actually gives us a greater understanding of what's going on for that kid. It's going, yeah, it's actually not his fault, not her fault. She's got a really hard time to do the things that have been asked of her for at school in particular. And, young kids don't understand this. So the question then is, what can we then do? Well, most common treatments around ADHD people have heard of are stimulants or amphetamines. So you got Ritalin, which is more common here in Australia, and Adderall more commonly in America. And yes, there is a huge uptake, especially in college and university campuses, of using these stimulants. And let's not go into the current difficulties of the modern world and distractions and being able to attend and social media. But there's a desire to be able to focus and attend to things better. But if we think about it, it's like, what are amphetamines? Amphetamines are stimulants, right? So they upregulate a lot of these different processes. Why on earth would we give stimulants or amphetamines to young children? And to begin to answer that, it's going, well, the research is quite interesting, quite clear that it's very common for individuals with ADHD to seek out different illicit drugs like cocaine and marijuana. And it's going, what's happening there? It's like these drugs actually increase dopamine. Cocaine in particular really does increase dopamine at a very high level. So people with ADHD, we thought that it was previously is like, oh, is it this because they have trouble focusing, is this ability to or inability to regulate desires and wants, and they're just impulsive and they just have the cocaine? It's like, no, they're actually attempting to self-medicate. It's like, and you see that as well with individuals that consume marijuana that have ADHD, is that actually, and it influences GABA and serotonin and a few other different neurochemicals, but they can actually focus a whole lot better. And so it's in this attempt to self-regulate. Now, I'm not advocating for those illicit drugs, but it is interesting that people with ADHD seek them out. And it comes back to what it's doing to the availability of dopamine in the brain. They actually can focus better. So that brings us back to the amphetamines that are regularly prescribed for ADHD. Now, they are very, very similar to street drugs, let's be honest. But there is some differences, slight chemical structural differences, as well as dose. Because on the surface, it seems absolutely wild to give a young child that is bouncing off the walls, can't stop moving, a stimulant. That seems to be counterproductive. That seems like the worst thing to do. Because yes, if we give kids sugar, and this is what we understand with kids on sugar and ADHD, is they will be attracted to sugar, but it just makes them even worse, right? They bounce off the wall. But if we understand what amphetamines do to the dopamine systems in the brain, is it increases the availability of dopamine in the brain for individuals with ADHD, which is different to people without ADHD, what it does to the brain. But people with ADHD in kids in small doses of amphetamines, is they actually can finally sit there and be still and listen and concentrate. So I'm not here to say whether you should medicate your kid or not. That's one of the hardest conversations to have. You should talk to your pediatrician around that. And if you're an adult, you should talk to your psychiatrist around that. What I can say in talking to the clients that I have diagnosed in the past with ADHD is that, there's certain circumstances for the use of medication. And if we go back to the understanding of the categorization of ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disorder, they have a chemical inability to actually attend and focus and regulate their emotions and movement. So if we give them a stimulant, if we give them medication that actually allows them to physically do that, what's that going to do for their life? And so, like all these different questions, it's a risk versus reward. But I think the important thing to understand is that there doesn't appear to be a dependency and a tolerance effect with drugs like Ritalin, which is a key differentiator between the illicit drugs that we spoke about before, is that, as we know, with using cocaine, highly addictive. So what we mean by tolerance and dependency is that I'm addicted, I need this. There's high addictive properties to that. I like this, I want more of it, I need it. And then the tolerance effect is that I need to chase that feeling that I had there. And so what happens in tolerance effects, and you can see this commonly in caffeine, is that when you have a certain amount, you need more to achieve the feeling that you had. And so both those two combined together is a very bad mix on top of the cardiovascular difficulties at those doses for those illicit drugs. So that's probably why we don't, especially cocaine in particular, we're not advocating for that. But Ritalin at the low doses that we prescribe to kids doesn't appear to have the dependency and the tolerance effects. And what we see is I can have a kid that's like, yeah, I take it Monday to Friday and I get great benefits from it, and I don't take it on Saturday and Sunday. And the kid doesn't feel a need to have it. He can concentrate better with it. And then when he goes back on Monday, it's totally fine. He can come off it, come back on it, and he doesn't need to increase the amount he has because he might be on it for, a year or two. Doesn't need to increase the amount to get the same amount of benefit. I think that's a very key point to put on that. Now, the other thing with the medication is that what we need to consider is that there's this emerging research around that we can age out of the disorder, which is really, really empowering and quite interesting. So I think the key is that instead of saying necessarily yes medication, no medication, I think there's also a nuanced approach that says if we can get the kids in early, and with this neuroplasticity that's happening between the age of 5 and 12, is that if we can provide the lowest possible dose at around that, when we tend to diagnose around that 9, 10 age sort of thing, if we can get in early there and provide the underlying chemical abilities to focus and to inhibit motor movement at a small dose, then it actually enables the kid to then be able to actually learn how to focus. So then there's the behavioral things you do on top of that. We won't go into that in detail, but that's where that actually learning how to focus and attend, call it open monitoring. So like your meditation, your mindfulness, teaching kids how to open monitor, which means being aware of all the other information that's going around them, is hugely important. And so what we can and do see is that through time they can wean themselves off the medication if we get in really early. Now with individuals that are undiagnosed, that are in adulthood, less likely to come off medication because that neuroplasticity is gone. So that might be more of a case where, that might be more a long-term thing. But the research is still emerging. But the key there is let's give the kids in particular an ability to actually learn how to focus, learn how to attend, have the biological ability to attend, and then let's work on the behavioral stuff. It's not just a silver bullet where you have this medication and then you don't do anything like that. The best evidence suggests that if you have the medication plus the behavioral interventions around learning how to attend and focus, has the best outcomes and is probably the best way to mitigate any perceived risks that people might have with medication. But I want to be very clear in that in the cases that I've seen personally with clients is a massive difference in impact in that kid's life. Because if we think about it, they didn't have an ability previously to be able to actually sit there and not move around, not want to jump up, actually sit there and attend and focus, and to be able to organize their life better. It's like, you're going to see a big difference. Now, the key is that the pharmacology with everyone is different. The psychopharmacology means that you've got a bunch of different chemicals and combination of things in your brain, is that it's going to take time to work out with the physician, whether it's a psychiatrist or a pediatrician, not me, is what is the best combination, because there's a bunch of different options now with dual release, single release, double dose. There's a bunch of different ways, and very commonly I've actually seen that it's worked the very first time. So it's just understanding how that works for you and finding the best balance like that. But what I can say is that it completely changes that individual's life, particularly with adults as well that have gone undiagnosed with their whole life, is that it is a huge change in their ability to attend, to organize their life, time management, all these different things is a massive increase in ability to do that. So with all that being said, I just wanted to give a very broad understanding of actually what ADHD is and what it's not. And when we actually understand how big the role that dopamine has with the neurocircuitry and the ability to inhibit or switch off certain neurons, really gives us a whole lot more appreciation of how much more difficult life is for these individuals. And also, I guess, empowering some individuals with it to go, if I can do something about it, and I can work towards really having a lot more control of my life in these different areas. So that's today's deep dive. Hit me up if you've got any questions about ADHD. Obviously, speak to your physician, your GP or your pediatrician to get an expert opinion on what you should do next. But this is just a very general understanding of it. If you like the content that we're doing here at Expressions of Interest, please share it with everyone, like it, subscribe, because it means more to me than probably what I could describe. And if I help just one person out there, one person gets something out of it, that's all I'm trying to do. And yeah, if you appreciate it and get some benefit, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Thanks for listening.